So one of the things about that, I'm super nerdy about this topic, but one of the things about that is I'm really interested not only in like what works and what doesn't work, but also why. I really like to unpack the why, because I think that we become more effective in implementing it if we kind of understand some of the underlying reasons for some of these things and underlying mechanisms. So when we were talking about this talk, I'm really interested in this question of kind of the whole idea of learning from experience and really sort of understanding some of the nuances behind it. Hence the title, so what does learning from experience really mean anyway? But first of all, like, you are awesome. I can tell this already, I know this because you're here. And that means that you're way ahead of the game. You're already kind of, this is already on your radar, you're already thinking about kind of the whole idea of learning from experience, all that kind of stuff. That's great, you guys get it. But do you ever have some trouble explaining it to other people? Right? That can be sometimes part of the challenge. And so that's hopefully one of the things that we'll be trying to look at is, can we take this thing that we know is a good idea, we know is effective, and start kind of being able to talk to people about it a little bit more, and being kind of explaining some of the reasoning behind it, and give you some evidence for that. Okay, just the show of hands, how many people agree with this statement of learning from experience? All right, yes, everybody agrees with this. So let's unpack it a little bit more. And this is this question that's kind of been one of my primary questions my entire professional life, is why do people do the wrong things? I don't mean morally wrong, but I mean, why do people do things when, say, they know the right answer and they still don't do it?
Lazy.
Right?
They're lazy.
Lazy. See, that's okay. I'm sure that there is some laziness that plays into it, but I also think there's some other kind of interesting and complicated reasons why that happens.
And what about contextually?
Yeah, it depends on context, absolutely. So things are wrong in some contexts but not in others.
And what about the system?
And what about the system? Right. So I know better than you, or whatever it might be.
Incentives are misaligned.
Misaligned incentives, that's one of my favorites. I bring that up a lot when I'm consulting. Let's talk about misaligned incentives. So.
Sometimes it's easier.
Easier, right, yeah, absolutely. So.
Well, the reality is of budget and schedule.
Yeah, so we know the right thing to do, but we have, I teach the Advanced Instructional Design for E-Learning Certificate Workshop for ASTD, which is far too many syllables. But I will occasionally get people who are like, I have a section on behavior-based learning, and I'm doing a session this afternoon on it, and they're like, we really want to do this, but we usually have a week to turn a course around. And I'm like, I cannot help you very much. I can give you a few small ideas, but mostly that's just flat out not enough time to design, an effective experience using game elements and things like that. So yes, absolutely, budget and constraints like that. What's that? Habit, yes. Ken was talking about habit and things like that. Now I would dispute some of the stuff that he was talking about, not wanting to get unconscious confidence, because I actually think we do want to leverage that as a tool. But the kind of habit that doesn't get examined very much is a problem too. Okay, so it's a simple question, but it has a lot of complicated answers, as you're sort of already pointing out. And sometimes it really is a knowledge problem. I can't buy printer paper from my brother-in-law, it has to go through purchasing. I had no idea. Or that coffee drink has 1,800 calories, really? It's Cold Stone Creamery, by the way, that seriously exists. Or how do you figure sales tax anyway? Like, these are knowledge problems. They're somebody just didn't know the right thing to do. And training and learning and development as a field has been pretty, starting to get pretty good at dealing with knowledge problems. However, there are all sorts of things that are not knowledge problems. So texting while driving, or eating too much fast food, or smoking, these are kind of these classic ones. Does anybody think that smokers exist because nobody has bothered to mention to them that it's a bad idea? Right? There are not very many people who don't know that this is a problem. I did a fairly large scale project. It was a research-based project at the University of Minnesota a few years back. I worked on it for a bit. That was basically safe sexual behaviors. And they were like, okay, so if people still aren't practicing safe sex, it's not because nobody's mentioned to them that like things like condom usage is a good idea. So why is it still happening? What are the reasons? And so we start to kind of unpack those things and look at why, if people know the right thing to do, are they not doing the right thing? So I usually refer to these as the I know but kinds of things. So let's take a look at texting while driving. I know it's a bad idea and I never do it, except when I do it and then I feel guilty. I know it's a bad idea, but I only do it once in a while and I'm very careful. I know it's a bad idea for other people, but I can do it because I'm really good at it. Right? Or there's occasionally just the, what's the big deal? Like that, we have an ignorance problem there, so we can actually address that through knowledge means. But if the problem isn't a knowledge problem, then more information doesn't help. Right? And this is our primary toolkit, is to give people more information. But if it's not a knowledge problem, why do we keep doing, not we in this room, but we in the wider world, why do we keep doing this if this isn't the problem?
I would say just maybe one exception to that is when they don't have enough information. Like,
Right.
I know that texting is bad, but they don't know that, you're not only threatening yourself, but you're threatening the other drivers on the road, the passengers in your car. So they don't have enough information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I won't think that information problems don't exist, and that there aren't some circumstances where more information really will help. But it seems to be kind of the only tool that we frequently see being leveraged, is I'm going to give people more information, therefore, we've got this behavior problem, we need to give people more information. But I think you're right. I mean, I think there's some instances where people, there's genuinely a lack of awareness, and so in that case, that may make a difference. Right, no follow-up, no accountability, absolutely. Yeah, so that's a big piece of it. So what does help? I mean, you guys are really good at coming up with reasons in that previous slide. So on this one, kind of what kinds of things do you think are helpful in a circumstance where it's not a knowledge problem and we're trying to encourage a behavior? What kinds of things do help?
Having an experience where you suffer the consequences of.
Right, yes. I mean, that's kind of probably like one of the just major overarching themes behind everything that's going to happen in the next couple of days and everything that we're trying to do is consequences. Traditional feedback is that's an incorrect choice, which quite frankly is an opinion. And I can choose to follow that opinion or I can choose to not follow that opinion. Consequences feel more like data, right? They feel more like this thing happens, and so therefore, okay. So that's one of the big things that you get out of scenario or simulation-based learning is you get consequence-based feedback. Because that's much, you were talking about, we had the suggestion down there that sometimes people just want to buck the system. And if you give people opinions, they can choose to agree or disagree with your opinion. If you give them consequences, that feels much more like this is the way it is, this is the way the world works. It feels much more concrete to people. What else? What else can be helpful?
I think getting them something that truly matters.
Right.
And I'll use the smoking, not necessarily to texting,
Mhm.
but an individual that has a new grandchild.
Mhm.
That gives them a purpose.
Yeah.
More so, if they're not thinking about themselves, perhaps, they think about being there for the new grandchild. More than
Yes,
themselves.
absolutely. Yeah, there's a whole kind of technique called motivational interviewing, and they teach it to doctors who then use it as a way of kind of talking to patients about meeting their health goals and things like that. And that's one of the kind of key tenets, is tying it to what do you really care about or what you really want, and being able to kind of see the connection between those things. So, anything else? Any other suggestions?
You can create empathy.
Empathy?
It might be like the same thing as experience or motivation, but
Mhm.
yeah, for some reason that struck me as something that might be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. No, I think that's definitely a good one. I saw a hand over here.
The idea of having them be touched on an emotional level,
Mhm.
not just that it matters to them, but that they're affected by that. Yes, I know that people die because they text in their car. I might even see those bashed up cars that they leave in high school parking lots and
Right.
say, well, this guy was texting. But if you talk to a kid about a friend who died because he was texting in the car, it touches you more in your heart than it does just see.
Yeah, having that kind of emotional sort of reaction to stuff. Okay, so I've been kind of organizing my thoughts on this into a couple of different categories. And one of them is visceral, like things that feel, and it kind of goes to that emotional and that affective component and things like that. Then there's the issue of contextual experiences, automatic experiences and embodied experiences. So if we look through and kind of start to think about, like, what are we getting from experience, experience-based learning and things like that, it starts to kind of fall into some different categories. I want to talk a little bit more about each of these. So visceral, relating to deep inward feelings rather than to the intellect. And I think this is a really important one. It kind of gets put in this touchy-feely bucket, and yet it's actually really important to the way that people operate in the world. So we need to kind of pull it back out of the touchy-feely bucket and start kind of dealing with it in a more concrete sense. So I'm going to start with something. Anybody ever heard of the trolley problem? No. Okay. All right. All right, here's the scenario. You are standing by some train tracks and there's a trolley going down the track, and it's running away. It's out of control, and there's 5 workers on the track that are going to get run over by the trolley. And you're standing by the switch, the thing where you can switch trains. You can't stop the trolley, but you can switch the track. And you can switch it onto a different track where there's only 1 worker. So right now it's going to kill 5 workers, but if you flip the little lever, it'll switch over and only 1 person's going to die. Okay? So how many people would flip the switch? Okay. And that's pretty consistent. It usually comes out about 90%, right? 90% of people say, yes, I would flip the switch. And it's a better outcome. It's not a good outcome, but it's a better outcome. All right, so different scenario. You're standing on a bridge above the trolley track, and there's a couple other people right next to you, and you see the runaway trolley, and it's going towards the 5 workers, but it's only 1 track this time, there's no switch. And if you can stop the trolley somehow, the 5 workers will be spared. So you're a small little person, you can't do anything about this trolley, but right next to you there's this really enormous big guy, and he's leaning way over, and if you just give him a little push, he'll fall onto the track and he'll stop the trolley. How many people are going to push the guy off the bridge? I got 1 over here. 2. I got 2. All right. So it's math-wise, it's the same problem, right? 1 person dies, 5 people live. What's wrong with the second one?
You got to actually become involved in the death of the other one in a more tangible way. You're physically pushing him.
Yeah.
So there's something about
We
that.
also don't.
There's something about that physical touch to another human.
Right. You got to lay hands on this guy. You are pushing him off a bridge.
You make an active decision to kill somebody rather than a passive decision.
Well, although arguably flipping the switch, you've made an active decision to kill.
But you're saving more. I mean, to me.
Right. No, I understand, and I agree. I'm the same. I'm right there with you. I'd be flipping the switch, but I wouldn't be pushing the guy off the bridge. So I'm right there.
I actually don't know that it'll work.
Well, there's that problem. So let's assume that you were really, really, really confident that it would work. But for the sake of the thought experiment, be right, absolutely. Because then it would really suck.
Why don't I just yell, get off the track?
You win. So they're too far away, they can't hear you. Okay, so this is a really interesting one. This has been, I think this originally came out, Flip was the person who originated this in like the late 60s, and it's been actually done as a thought experiment in philosophy and a few other places quite a while. And then came Joshua Green, who a few years ago, actually looks like about 10 years ago, did this one in an fMRI. Which is a functional magnetic resonance imaging, and it basically looks at what areas of the brain activate under certain conditions. So he did the trolley problem in an fMRI. And I'm going to tell you that this is a slight cheat. This is actually from a later study, so this isn't quite the right brain image, but it gets the right image. But take it with a big grain of salt. You should actually always take brain image pictures in anything with a grain of salt, because they've proved that people will find articles more credible if there's a picture of brains next to it. Regardless of whether or not the picture is actually support the data in the article. It just looks better and people are more likely to believe it. So anytime anybody shows you a picture of pretty brains, take it with a little bit of a grain of salt. But we're getting kind of a similar breakdown in here, and I won't get into the specific areas, but what happens is the place where the decision's being made in the brain is different in those two problems. So in the first case, I'm flipping a switch. I'm making this decision in a way that's basically doing the calculation. 5 is better than 1. We're gonna flip the switch, right? And it's made kind of, there's areas in your prefrontal cortex and places like that where it's kind of like logical decision-making place in your brain. Now, we tend to think of our brain as a single sort of coherent entity, and it's really, really not. It's a set of messy emergent systems that have all kind of evolved up together and frequently argue with each other, basically. So what we're having in this sort of more difficult situation, which is kind of like our situation with the pushing the guy off the bridge, is you're having a much more emotional visceral reaction. So we're engaging areas like midbrain areas and the limbic system and the amygdala and things like that, where a lot more kind of emotional things happen as opposed to sort of a pure reasoning challenge. You can treat the first example like a pure reasoning challenge. The second example becomes much more of an emotional decision. Now, the issue, and the reason I kind of wanted to bring this up, is pure emotion makes a lot of our decisions, or a lot of our decisions are moderated by emotion. And so kind of understanding where are these decisions getting made and where are behaviors happening can actually be something that's really sort of important and useful to us. This is a metaphor that I really like. It's Jonathan Haidt, who's a psychologist. He does a lot on positive psychology, moral psychology. He's actually gotten in the last few years really involved in political psychology. And he has a book called The Happiness Hypothesis. He's got a metaphor in the book that he uses. And the metaphor is the idea that your brain is like a rider and an elephant. How many people have seen this one before? Okay, just a couple. So the rider is your conscious verbal thinking brain. Again, it's this nice prefrontal cortex area is heavily involved. It's the most recently evolved part of your brain. It's the part of your brain that plans for the future and kind of, thinks logically through problems. And the elephant is all of kind of these older areas. So your brain sort of starts down here where there's a lot of automatic things like breathing and walking, and then you've kind of got the midbrain, which is heavily involved. I'm vastly overgeneralizing, by the way. But you've got kind of the emotional brain, then we've kind of got this sort of logical prefrontal cortex brain up in the front. And again, big, wide overgeneralizing about brain anatomy. But so we've got these two different parts. Now we tend to think that the rider's in charge quite a bit, right? It's our logical brain. We make logical decisions. We're logical people. And yet, a lot of times, so, the rider is the one that's saying, I should order a salad, and I really should get this homework out of the way so that I can enjoy the rest of my evening, or exercising now will give me more energy later, right? This is all rider, logical, makes complete sense. The elephant's saying, French fries, or hey, look, celebrity chef deathmatch is on, or I'm just gonna lie down on the couch for 1 minute. So, part of the difficulty is we kind of are more having a conversation with our rider, but our elephant's kind of making decisions. So what do you think happens when there's a conflict between the two? So how many people have ever done the thing where you're lying in bed and you're going, I need to get up, I know I need to get up. If I don't get up now, I'm gonna be late and it's gonna just mess up my whole day, and I need to get up and I really need to get up. And you hit the snooze button anyway? Yeah. Right? So we have this logical relationship where we're saying, I'm making all these decisions, and yet we're making decisions all the time based on what the elephant wants. And the elephant doesn't talk to you, the elephant just feels things. Anybody ever say procrastinated? Ever? Right? Right? I saw no one, my hands go up. Okay, now you're starting to freak me out. All right. I think procrastination is pure elephant. Okay, how long can I wait until the prospect of not doing this is more unpleasant than the prospect of doing it? Okay, at least another 4 hours. Okay. So if we're not talking to the elephant or we're not engaging the elephant, we're not talking to one of the big decision makers, right? So that kind of starts to become why this becomes really important. Because if we're not engaging this thing that's a big decision maker, we're not gonna get people to do things or change behaviors or take action or all of those sorts of things. Also, I think that when we think about we learn from experience, we're not really thinking about kind of experience at the level of granularity we need. So I want to tell you a story about a friend of mine. This is my friend Samantha. It's not actually a picture of her, but it's somebody who kind of looks like her from the Clip Art store. So my friend Samantha joined the Y this is a couple of years ago. And when she joined the Y, she got 2 free personal training sessions. And so she went in and she figured, oh, you know, they're going to set me up on the machines, and they're going to give me a little program or whatever. She goes into this free personal training session. She hadn't been a member of a gym in a while. And so she gets there, and this woman put her through her paces, okay? She worked her hard. She's doing lunges across the gym floor, and she's doing all this kind of stuff. And she was so sore the next day she could barely move. What did she learn from this experience? Exercise sucks, right? Is what she learned from this experience. So here's the thing, is the elephant isn't stupid. Right? It's difficult and it's not necessarily what you want, but it's not stupid. It says, this is unpleasant. We should avoid this. So this goes to this issue of what experience are people having? So if you want somebody to do a new method for interviewing people, that's what you're trying to teach in simulation, you're trying to teach interviewing skills. And the experience that they have with it are clunky and horrible and weird when they first try to implement it. What happens at that point? They don't want to do it again, right? You know, and we know that like if they could just persist a little, they could get better, but that's still really a hard thing to learn. So, how many people know that it's bad to text while driving? Okay, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands on this next question. How many people have learned this through personal experience? You know, when we do this stuff, we try to figure out how do we have kind of these personal experiences. And so if we go back and we look at this question of what's our experience with this, I think this is one of the reasons that these behaviors are really tough and really intractable is, okay, driver number 1, the first time they text while driving, it's fine. The second time they text while driving, crash, nasty fender bender. And that person's clear now. They don't text while driving. It cost them a lot of money and it was unpleasant and nobody liked it. Although I was showing this example someplace else and somebody's like, yeah, and actually it turns out that there is actually a fair amount of recidivism, even after people have had car accidents, if they're really chronic about it. I'm like, oh, great, wonderful, you had to make the problem harder. But how about driver number 2? So they're text while driving, it's fine, second time, third time, fourth time, fifth time, sixth time. You know, we get that behavior reinforced by every time we do it and nothing bad happens. So we can say bad things will happen, and yet the immediate experience is, no, this is actually fine. Which is, you know, if we go back to like smoking, for example, what is the experience of smoking? For if you're a smoker, I don't know if anybody's a smoker here, you don't need to tell me, but I mean, like, what do we think the experience is for somebody smoking? What is the experience of a cigarette?
Pleasurable.
Yeah, it's a good experience, right? If you're a smoker and you smoke a cigarette, there's a pleasurable aspect to it. So that's what we're fighting against when we're dealing with things where the immediate experience is behaviors we want to have happen, but the immediate experience is bad, or behaviors we want to kind of extinguish where the immediate experience is good. This is one of these things that we really kind of suck at, is figuring out how to deal with kind of long-term consequences. So we not only have to think about what is the experience within the training or the simulation or things like that, but then what's the experience in the world when it goes out? So that's, I think, one of the interesting things is looking at what that transition is. And a lot of times we as training people don't have a lot of control over that experience once they actually are out in the world and they start to try to use it. But that's one of those things where that's, I think, one of the big areas where we can do better, is try to figure out how are we partnering with the managers or the supervisors or the people to make sure that the first couple of experiences that people have with whatever it is we're trying to do once they go back into the world, don't immediately try to convince them that this was a sucky idea in the first place and I should just go back to what I was doing before. So looking at that when we talk about learning from experience is we're a little bit ahead of the game in that we can kind of have some control over the experience that they have in the simulation. But if we're not looking forward into what experience are they having in the real world, we're probably not getting as far as we'd like to get. This and how visceral the experience is matters too. This is a really interesting study. This was done out of the virtual reality lab at Stanford. And they wanted to teach people about the consequences of paper usage because that's something where it's really disconnected. Like how many napkins I take at the fast food restaurant, connecting that up to trees being cut down. And having a really visceral, again, a really kind of concrete sense of if I do this behavior in the real world, these are the consequences of it. And so they did an educational piece that everybody did around just sort of understanding the connection, like these are the trees that get cut down to make these paper napkins, that kind of thing. And then they had two groups. And group A read a story about cutting down, not a story, but a description about cutting down trees and the aspect of cutting down trees, and it was very sort of vividly written and things like that. Group B went into a virtual reality environment and actually cut down trees. Like they had a controller and they actually did this where they were sort of seeing this consequence of these trees being cut down to support the paper needs and paper usage and things like that. Now afterwards, all of the people who had been through this intervention said, yes, my attitude has been changed. I am more aware now than I was before of the consequences of cutting down, consequences of paper usage, and I will moderate my behaviors. They all said that, they all said kind of the right thing. Then we did a thing with the researchers where the researchers would knock over some water and have paper napkins right there, and then see how many paper napkins the people used to clean up the spill. And the people who had had the visceral experience of cutting down trees as opposed to just reading about it used 20% less paper napkins than the people who had been doing the paper, who just kind of like thought about it cognitively. Now, I'm not totally sure how to extrapolate this out into what we do, but I think it's really interesting. Like the degree to which, even though intellectually people had all kind of been on the same page, their actual behavior had changed depending on how visceral and how real the experience had been. There's my paper napkins. And how visceral things are, or how real they seem, can really make a difference in choices. This was from a study. This is another one of my favorite studies. It's actually also at Stanford, come to think of it. But it was, they were looking at how kind of using cognitive effort influenced choices that people made. So they had a group doing easy math problems and they had a group doing hard math problems. And right around the middle of the thing, they came up and they said, "We've got a snack for you. Would you like fruit, or would you like this lovely fruit salad, or would you like this chocolate cake?" The people doing the hard math problems took the chocolate cake almost 2 to 1 over the people doing easy math problems. So we've got this thing where the more effort that we expend, kind of that seems to deplete other resources and other areas for willpower. But the really interesting thing about it is that they really only saw this significant effect if they were actually showing people the fruit salad versus the cake. If they said, "We're going to go get you a snack, would you like fruit salad versus cake?" people were much more able to kind of lean towards the healthy option and choose the fruit salad. So they were really only seeing the really pronounced effect when I'm actually holding chocolate cake in front of you. So again, it's another example of how if the experience is visceral, it has more of an impact on the choices that people make. So it's interesting. I'm working out for myself as a designer, how do we deal with this? People don't do very well with delayed consequences. So I'm actually going to skip that slide for a moment and come back to it. We're really creatures of urgency. We're concerned with what's happening now, or at least our elephants are very concerned with what's happening now. Our elephants do not care what's going to happen in 6 months or 5 years or 20 years, which is, again, I'd rather have the pleasurable smoke now than worry about the emphysema in 20 years or whatever it is. And so, you know, and really we're the main people who kind of plan ahead. They do a lot of studies looking at whether animals can actually plan ahead and do things. And some of it seems to be instinctual behaviors, but we're really the only ones who like, I need to save for retirement. So one of the things if we're trying to engage learners is try to figure out how to make things immediate, which is again a big argument for scenario-based learning, for simulations and things like that. Because what we really want is not people saying, I'll be glad I'll know this someday. We're much more likely to catch people if they're saying, I'm glad I know this right now. So if you give people a reason that they need to know this and do this right now, that not only talks to their kind of cognitive side, but it's also talking to the elephant. Oh, there's a reason I need to pay attention right now. Okay, fine. So how many people have ever had to go through health savings account in training in some kind, form? Yes. Or any kind of benefits paperwork? So the contrast to this, or the sort of design principle behind this is, if I'm talking to you about health savings account procedures, I'm talking to you about something that you may not need for 6 months or a year or until your next doctor's visit or whatever. So how do I make that more immediate? Well, I can give you a list of 3 scenarios and ask you to go through the health savings account paperwork and figure out if they're covered or not. So I have something that I need to do immediately right now with this. So I think that's one of the big design challenges. How do I make it feel immediate? How do I make it feel, it's just in case I might need this someday, but how do I make it feel like I need it right now? And moving that sort of sense of urgency up forward and things like that. Because we suck at future consequences. We're really bad at it. The behavioral economists have looked at this quite a bit with hyperbolic discounting. So if I offered you $10 today versus $11 tomorrow, how many people would hold out for the $11? Okay, all right, about half, give or take. If I offered you $10 today versus $11 a year, how many people would hold out for the $11? Nobody, right? The economists have looked at this and they've mapped it out like you wouldn't believe. They've done this kind of formula and stuff like that. If I offered you $10 today or $1,000 in a year, how many people would hold out for the $1,000? Right? Okay. So there's this curve. How big does the reward need to be in order to make it worthwhile for me to wait for it? Or how serious does the consequence need to be in order for me to make it worthwhile for me to wait for it? And if it's not a serious enough consequence and we have to wait a long time for it, we just don't care, right? So what we're looking at doing is how are we moving these things up closer so that we're dealing with that sense of urgency for people. And that's true in learning environments, but it's also true in the work environment too. I work for a company that always tracked their hours on timesheets, and everybody was always getting their timesheets in late because they had 60 million projects and the timesheets were a problem. And so they implemented this thing, and they're like, well, if you don't get all your timesheets at the end, you miss out on like this $25, bonus at the end of the quarter, except that didn't get paid at the end of the quarter, it actually got paid afterwards when they finally settled out the accounting and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, $25 4 months from now is not gonna beat out the I have to return 4 client calls this morning, I don't have time to do my timesheet. So when we look at why people do things, this goes to that misaligned incentives, which you brought up. When we look at these things, how are we getting these things to match up better? Because the elephant likes things that are immediate, and the elephant likes things that are shiny. So if we're going to ask them to pay attention, we need to kind of play to that a little bit. And so this is we've already talked through most of these, but the whole issue of immediate consequence versus delayed consequence. How big does it need to be? How significant does it need to be? We're also loss averse. We worry more about losing things than we are motivated by gaining things. So there's kind of a specific curve to the loss aversion thing, where getting $25 doesn't feel correspondingly better than losing $25. So if you threaten to take away $25, that's going to be somewhat more significant. It's still $25. It's still not that big a deal, but that's going to feel worse to people than gaining $25. will. So we have this tendency towards the loss aversion side of the spectrum. So like how visceral, how immediate things are, those are all questions that are going to have an influence of behavior and that I do think we need to be considering as designers. The next big piece of this, and the next big reason I think that scenario-based and experience-based learning is really, really important is context. The circumstances that form the setting of an event, statement, or idea in terms of which it can be fully understood and assessed. So I have a question for you. If you had to pick a place, you've got to study for a test, you're taking a class, and you need to pick a place to study, is your preference to study in a quiet library? Is it your favorite coffee shop? Or is it the gray windowless classroom with the noisy HVAC system where that you usually meet for class? Now this is preference, there's no wrong answer. How many people would prefer number one? A couple people? A lot of people, fair number of people. Okay, number two? That's got a strong vote for coffee shop. Number three? Just a couple. Okay. So from kind of what we know about how memory works, 3 is actually going to give you a bit of a leg up if you're studying in there. And that's because the environment that you're in becomes part of the memories that you form. So even if you're studying Chinese history and you're in a classroom, part of the classroom becomes part of the memory for Chinese history. So if you're studying in the same space where you're retrieving the information, we're going to see better results. And this has been a fairly kind of replicated result. I think, Will, it was from one of your research reports that I picked up a lot of this stuff. Don't you have a research report on specific this kind of area?
Context alignment, yeah.
Context alignment, thank you. Yeah, go read that. So when we think about what we're learning, we're teaching this, right? We're teaching this little thing right here. But learning is actually all of this. And so that's an interesting area when we think about immersion, and we think about immersive media, and we think about all of those kinds of things, is how are we leveraging context as a way of kind of promoting learning for things. What kind of associations do people have with lavender? Like, what do you think of if I say lavender? Calming? Sleepy? What's that? British, yeah. So there's all these associations with lavender. One of my big associations with lavender, Fannie Mae, right? And I'll tell you why. I was working in DC, I was working for a client, and I lived down the street from the Fannie Mae building. The Fannie Mae building on DC, it's on like Wisconsin Avenue, I think, I can't remember, but if you walk by, it has a lot of beautiful lavender plants growing outside in front of the building. And I was there right when like all of the Fannie Mae stuff was happening, and there were like people coming out taking pictures of the building to use for news shots and all this kind of stuff. So I would always be walking by, it would always be this lovely smell of lavender, and it would always be like thinking about Fannie Mae. And so now I have these things kind of linked together in my mind, and so when I think of lavender, I think of Fannie Mae. I've also not used this example for a few times, so I have made this permanent, this association. But we don't always have a lot of control over this. Like the associations that we get between something and something else aren't always deliberate. However, this is a tool in your toolkit, right, as designers, is to start trying to figure out how do we make some of these kinds of things, and use some of these kinds of things deliberately, these associations. Because a lot of times this isn't done very well. Like if this is the context for learning, and this is the context for use, we're not making very good use of that environment as a way to kind of help retrieve and trigger learning. Because it's not good enough to just get the memory in there, you gotta be able to get it back out. This is my issue with themes in training products. I've had a lot of things where we're like, we want to increase engagement, so we're thinking we want to use like a sports theme for lean manufacturing processes. We're thinking it's going to be used globally, so we don't want to use football, we're thinking soccer. Everybody loves soccer, right? So we're going to use a soccer theme for lean manufacturing processes. Okay, so let's say soccer or football or whatever. You've got lean manufacturing processes, you've got memories that are going to help you retrieve this association. When do you typically watch sports? Right, yeah. So let's say we use a football theme. When do you watch football? Sunday afternoon. It's Sunday afternoon when you need to be retrieving information about lean manufacturing processes. right? And I mean, it's not necessarily going to do harm per se, but it's certainly a missed opportunity of kind of creating that association and then being able to kind of retrieve that information out of it. So triggering somebody's memory about lean manufacturing processes while they're watching the halftime show is not super useful, you know? So what can we do about that kind of stuff? And we tend to decontextualize a lot because it helps with simplicity and clarity. There's this real strong desire to decontextualize, but we have problems with it because we're not looking at triggers, we're not looking at kind of things that are influencing stuff, we're not looking at all of the sorts of things that are influencing it. So RAIN is recognized that this is first responders for a WMD attack. This is a training program. This is Allen Interactions let me use this, which is very nice of them, and I want to do a little shout out there. Recognize the threat, avoid the hazard and contamination, isolate the hazard area, and notify the appropriate personnel. So this is information, right? This is knowledge. These are the things I need to do in a WMD attack, right? So the problem with that is if we look at things like, we're missing kind of a lot of these things around context and these things around triggers. Let's talk about triggers for a moment. I have actually a slide. Yeah, okay, sorry. I'm realizing I was kind of monkeying with these slides and now I'm like, no, this slide should be before these two, so bear with me. But if we think about triggers, let's say you're training a call center on a process for dealing with angry customers. You want people to do these steps. You want them to first acknowledge that the person is right to be upset, and then you want them to assure them that you're going to help them find a solution, and then so I've got these 3 steps that I want everybody to do when they get an angry customer in this call center environment. What triggers will tell somebody that they need to start using this process or activate this knowledge?
Angry tone of voice.
Angry tone of voice, yep, absolutely. Harsh words, yeah. Maybe somebody swears at you.
Their own physical reaction.
Yeah, okay. So we've got some specific triggers that says, oh, I should jump over to this 2 thing where I acknowledge and then I assure them I will help and then I start getting more information. Like those are my steps. So what happens when somebody's angry with you? What's that?
They yell.
Yeah, they yell. And what happens to you when somebody's angry at you?
You get emotional.
You want to get away from it. You want to avoid. Are you saying, oh, I should think about that training class that I went to, and there were some specific strategies that were helping with this situation? Probably not. You're thinking, oh God, don't yell at me, right? And the elephant's going, oh God, don't yell at me. So we want to start creating that association. If you have this trigger, we should go to this behavior. And having some habit formed around that and having some automaticity around that helps avoid the reaction and go straight into this. So we want to actually use context and things like that to help kind of foster those behaviors.
Question about maybe granularity of triggers. So this would be a visual trigger, and I think we all get it. He's angry, but the ones we talked about were verbal triggers.
Yeah.
But they maybe in us create the same emotional response. Is that okay if we get the end result,
that's a really
but our
good
triggers
question.
are different?
I think if you can do the actual trigger, you're better off. So in this instance, I actually wouldn't use a picture. I'd try to use an audio clip. Failing that, inducing the same feeling is better than nothing at all. If you can induce that feeling with the actual trigger, that's your best case scenario. I was working with a group that did a lot of stuff around phobias. And so one of the things they would do is they were trying to train people to deal with their phobias. So one of the things they would do is they'd say, what symptoms do you get when you have this phobia? So if you've got claustrophobia, what happens? Do you get shortness of breath? Does your pulse race? Do you get dizzy? Whatever. And then they would actually induce it. So if you said, the main thing is I get dizzy, they would spin you around in a chair and then talk to you about strategies for dealing with it. Because they wanted you to have that physical feeling while you were learning the material. So the answer is yes, you're still better off if you can induce it in some way. However, if you can induce it with the actual trigger, that's the best case. Okay, so let's go back to this one. So we've got RAIN, and right now this is as decontextualized as you can get. There is no context here, right? Or almost no context. I mean, there's still the context that, hey, we're talking about WMD attacks. But we know that, that that's a bit of an issue. So based on what we're talking about. So I'm going to show you this was the intro piece. So I'm going to actually show you the piece that they built for this. And what I want you to do is tell me how they're creating a sense of context in this. We'll see if the audio works.
What does the mask, can you see?
All right, so we've got a vehicle explosion, south end of the city, possible casualties. All right, so now I've got some choices to make. I can move forward, I can report some information, I can request support, I can scan, I can put on a gas mask. Let's see. All right, so I'm gonna get closer so I can just see what's going on. Okay, I've got people lying on the ground. I've got the guy with the camera. I've got different things like this. Let's see. I can take a closer look. Okay, I've got kids lying on the ground. There's casualties. There's this woman here. There's a bus. There's a guy videotaping. Okay, so should I move forward to help the vision? What should I do? Move forward to help the victims get out of the car, maintain position, retreat 200 yards to original position. What's the best choice? What do you want to do? Don't even worry about best choice. What do you want to do? Help the kids. We're going to move forward to help the victims. Secondary explosive device detonated when you move too close to the incident, resulting in your immediate death. You probably killed some other people by doing that. Okay, so we'd have to start over and try this again. So there's actually a reason why you want to establish a perimeter around these kinds of things, it turns out. We had these steps and they were great, but are they more meaningful in context, basically? If I'm saying that I need to recognize, avoid, isolate, and then notify, like, do those things become more meaningful if you've just blown yourself up with a backpack and probably killed several bystanders? Right? Okay, so we talked about this before. This is this whole issue of consequence versus, consequence versus, I can tell you it's a good idea to stop and wait and kind of figure out what's going on before you rush forward, and yet there's small children lying on the ground and you want to help them. So we're dealing with the kind of impulse between those two things. How did that piece, which isn't the most immersive piece ever, but I think it still kind of does some of the things we wanted to do, how did that piece establish some context?
For one, it did things that maybe a lot of people wouldn't right off the bat notice, but like as you move closer, the volume got louder.
Right.
So they
Yeah.
made it a little more realistic.
Yeah, and it used those kinds of sound effects that you would be hearing in those circumstances and things like that. Mm-hmm.
Inspired a range of emotions really quickly.
Mhm.
You've got children lying on the ground, you've got, what should I do? And then you've got this guy videotaping.
Right.
So, you're feeling all kinds of things.
Yeah, absolutely. So, that's going to be one of the things that happens in these real instances is there's going to be several different things that you're going to need to respond to. And so being able to kind of think through and deal with that, you might know the 4 principles of what you're supposed to do, but actualizing that in that environment is a really different thing.
To me, I think when information is presented in my head, when I picture things, I'm in control of what I am envisioning.
Mhm.
This gives me things that I maybe would not have anticipated. And so now I'm forced to deal with those versus when it's just information that's presented, I'm in control of how I picture it.
Mhm. Right. So you may be picturing like, of course I would do this, and then I would do this, and then I would do this, and then all of a sudden, when you're in the real environment, you're like, oh, this is hard. Yeah, and having to kind of work through that feeling and things like that.
I didn't like the choices that you made,
Uh-huh.
because when I saw the lady with the baby, I thought, okay, she could be carrying a weapon.
Uh-huh.
And the guy with the camera, I thought, I don't trust him.
Yeah.
I'm not moving forward. I'm gonna call for backup. I'm gonna do something else.
Yeah.
My instinct told me that even though they have kids on the ground, you could be trying to put me into a dangerous situation.
Mhm.
So I think what we do is each person in that class could have approached it in a different way
Yeah.
and gotten a different solution. So
Yeah.
I like the way that that was done
Mhm.
because each individual participant gets to try his or her own way through it.
Right. There's a really great, it's like a video kind of podcast thing called Extra Credits, and it's about game design. And one of my favorite ones is one that talks about choices versus calculations. And they talk about the fact that a lot of things are calculations. Like there's a right answer and you can just find it, you know. And maybe you need to kind of play the game for a while to really uncover it, but there's a right answer, you know. And if you just kind of try different things and stuff like that, you'll find it. Choices are competing right answers. So in a game, I can go the slow route, but it's safer. Or I can go the fast route, but it's more dangerous. So I've got two competing priorities there that are in conflict with each other. I want to get there as quickly as possible and I want to get there as safely as possible, but I can't do both. I have to pick. So what am I feeling better about? Am I feeling better about staying safe, just kind of how my gameplay works, versus am I feeling better about like, you know, no guts, no glory, kind of like I'm going the fast route. So trying to figure out how to set those circumstances up. So this is a good one. I mean, in this one there is kind of a right answer in terms of what we want you to do, but it's never wrong to have this impulse to want to go help the children who are lying on the ground, right? So we've got a competing thing. I need to do the right thing, but versus I want to go help these kids. So therefore, I need to work that out. I basically need to rehearse that for myself because I'm going to have that in the future. And if I haven't rehearsed it, I'm not really going to believe that I shouldn't rush forward and take care of the kids. And so when we think about design, I think we should be looking at what the triggers are in the environment.
June, I'm sorry to interrupt, but
No, it's okay.
going back to, there's one more thing that's subtle that's happening on the screen.
Mhm.
It is the time. Because
Yeah.
it induces stress on the learner so that now they feel that they're on your time.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's actually a really good example of what you were talking about, which is should we use the photo to induce stress? Because I want these people to feel kind of stressed. You don't want them to feel incredibly stressed because that actually starts to block the acquisition of new knowledge, but mild stress heightens people's arousal and makes things feel more, more that greater sense of urgency, and there's a greater degree of engagement. And so that's an example of that kind of thing. Like obviously there's no specific real clock going on, and yet it heightens that feeling of stress. Because I want that feeling of stress to not interfere with you being able to execute these behaviors when you get in the real world. So if you, and I've got slides on this in a few minutes, but if you feel like the emotional context really matters, you want the emotional context of when you're learning it to feel somewhat similar to the emotional context of when you're using the
I think without the block, I don't think it would keep the same level of stress because you're going to see what you have to react to.
Yes, so thank you, I'm glad you brought that up.
Exactly. That's why it's
Yeah,
well put there.
so yes, thank you for mentioning that one. So when we're sitting down with our users, I'm a big fan of job shadowing. I think that it's the best analysis ever. Like you can skip almost all the other, that's not true, it's exaggeration. You can skip a lot of other analysis and just go follow people around. And one of the reasons is you find out how people really do things and all of that kind of stuff. But the other thing is you see what the triggers are in their environment. So when do I need to use this behavior? When do I need to use this behavior? What does the room look like? What does the setting look like? What papers do I have in my hand? What's on my computer screen? All of those kinds of things help you figure out what those triggers are when you're trying to create an association between the trigger and the behavior. And anything that you can do to kind of create that association makes it more likely that the behavior is actually going to occur. So we talked about that. This is trying to, I do this thing where I set bookmarks for myself. I'm like, okay, I need to do this thing in the morning on my way out. Like I need to remember to take the mail with me. So actually setting up something that reminds me, like where I put the letters or things like that, to remind myself that I need to take the mail with me and mail it on the way to work or something like that. So trying to create this association, when I see this, do this. That's the sort of behavioral heuristic we're trying to instill. And so emotional context is what we were just talking about. So if you're a healthcare professional and you're taking a webinar on strategies for dealing with irate patients, so like patients who are really upset or potentially dangerous or whatever it is, what's the emotional context of taking a webinar? Like, how do you actually feel when you're in a webinar? You're distracted, right? Yeah. What's that?
Why am I here?
Why am I here? How do you typically like just your physical feeling, not what you're thinking, but just your physical feeling when you're taking a webinar?
You're relaxed because it's low stress, low
Yeah.
involvement.
It's maybe a little sleepy. You're distracted by other things. It's not. So like your emotional context during learning is this very sort of like thing, or distracted or whatever. The emotional context during application is obviously very, very different. So this goes to what exactly, thank you for bringing that up because it's a perfect example. We want to see if we can't match these two things up. Because if you learn something in a very emotionally calm environment that you need to use in a very emotionally fraught environment, that emotional stress and all of that fraughtness is going to interfere with you being able to apply that because you're going to go into the older behaviors that you've had since childhood, which are like, that kind of thing. And so to get past that reaction, you want to try to match those things a little bit better. And an online, the responding to WMD attack gets you closer. They also do live simulations where you're running around and there's people on gurneys and there's stuff, and that's really where they're starting to kind of get the juice behind that, of getting it as close to feeling like the real thing as you possibly can. So I think there's a limit to what we can do in online environments sometimes, although you can certainly get closer than we often do. Okay, I've got about 15 minutes. And facts need context too. So for example, if I tell you a fact, I tell you the sales commission is 10%. That sounds like a really objective fact, right? Right? I mean, it's firm number, it's a thing, there's nothing kind of ambiguous about that. But using that information really depends on the context. So it might be the sales commission is going to be 10%, and that's awesome. Or it might be the sales commission is going to be 10%. Are you kidding me? Or it might be, oh God, the sales commission is going to be 10%. What are we going to do? So these, even objective facts, have to have some emotional context around it before you know what to do with that information. Me telling you that the sales commission is 10% is not enough to know how should I feel about that. And so again, that's one of the things we really get from kind of an experience-based environment is understanding, like, is that a good thing, is it a bad thing, what do I do with that information, all that kind of stuff. And so when we take all that information and we put it into a decontextualized format, because it's simpler and it's easier to understand if it's 4 letters and it spells out an equation. And I'm not criticizing that impulse. I think that impulse is fine. I just don't think it's enough to take things and simplify them out to little models. Is fine, but then you need to then practice using them, basically. So we have this interesting thing around rational decision making. Sort of the Mr. Spock school of decision making. That is, by the way, the Mr. Spock cookie jar, which I found last night, which I love. I'm like, I need a Mr. Spock picture. So rational decision making. Antonio Damasio is a neuroscientist out of, I think he's at Columbia. And he's done a lot of research into people who have had brain injuries, either strokes or kind of car injuries and things like that have really lowered their emotional affect. They still have normal intelligence, they can still score okay on intelligence tests, but they just don't report feeling very strongly. They don't get angry, they don't get sad, they don't get happy, they're just very sort of flat emotionally. Now, how do you think that impacts their ability to make decisions? How many people think that sort of being flat emotionally would make you a better decision maker? A couple people? Okay. How many people think it will make you a worse decision maker? Okay, stronger vote for this. See, I told you guys are awesome. You're right. It's hands down. It makes them terrible decision makers to not have a strong emotional tug. Makes them really bad decision makers. It's even simple decisions like which shirt do I put on in the morning? What, which way am I going to drive to work? Like, it's almost to the point where it becomes sort of a disability. Like, they just don't have anything that kind of tips them towards one thing or another. So whether we're aware of it or not, emotion plays a role in almost all the decisions we make. Even if we're very confident of ourselves as rational decision makers. So if I'm trying to decide to buy a car, and I check all the consumer reports, and I get the thing that has the best gas mileage, and I get the thing that has the highest safety rating, and I maximize it down to that car, there's an emotional context of it in that I need to reinforce my view of myself as somebody who makes decisions that way. And if that gets messed with, then there's a whole, there's a whole self-image thing that goes into play with that. So we don't make any rational decisions per se. We almost always need an emotional tug. Anybody ever sat down with like a financial advisor and they say, which of these 3 mutual funds looks good to you, and you have no clue at all? Am I the only one who has this experience? All right. Again, but I've got nothing. I have no emotional tug, like nothing that kind of pulls me in one direction or the other. And I'm like, you pick, because I got nothing on this. So there's no, and part of the reason is I have no context for any of these things. We listen to these things whether we're aware of it or not. This is a fairly famous kind of psychology experiment that was done it's like Capilano Suspension Bridge, I think is the place. And so they basically, it was an experiment. They had this young woman who was part of, one of the experience pieces, and she had people fill out these sort of word association surveys. And she was approaching men, and she approached half of them in, I think, the parking lot or something, and half of them on a suspension bridge. It's not this actual one, it's something like that. All right, so what they were really looking for, she was apparently an attractive young woman, was basically one of the parts of the experiment is that they and I can't remember, it was something to do with like she gave them their phone number at the end or something. They basically looked at things like how many of them hit on her. And also they had some things in the word association to see whether or not certain words around sexuality and attraction were triggered in the word association stuff. And so what do you think the result was? How many people think that there was kind of a greater, higher score on those measures in the parking lot versus on the suspension bridge? How many people parking lot? Okay, a couple. How many people suspension bridge? Yeah, definitely. Way more stuff on the suspension bridge. So why would that be? Why would people be more kind of attracted to this woman on a suspension bridge? Yeah. So what are the feelings, the physical sensations when somebody's attracted to somebody? There's kind of a perilous quality to it. I mean, like physically,
Sweaty, your heart rate.
Yeah, your hands sweat, your heart gets, elevated. You get a little kind of tense and wired. What happens when you're on a great, like on a suspension bridge, but at a great height? You get sweaty, your heart rate, a little stressed out. So we're listening to, the idea behind this is that we're listening to these signals from our physical selves to help us, again, judge the situation and make certain choices. And so if we're stripping all of the context out of it that kind of creates these sorts of things, we're not really able to sort of use that input in to help us with some of this decision-making kind of thing. So we need to quit at 11? Is that the job? Roughly? Okay, all right. I'm not sure, that's okay. I'll try to, some of the stuff we've already talked about. So one of the other pieces of experience, we've already kind of covered this, I actually be able to go through it fairly quickly, but automatic, sort of done or occurring spontaneously without conscious thought or attention. We've already really talked about this idea behind triggers and actions and creating those associations so that people are doing things. Actually Ken referred to this, things we do automatically, things that we have to think about. And this kind of similar to the elephant and the rider, but it's a little bit different in that we can kind of train it up. We have automatic reactions like snakes, ooh, bad, jump back. We have slower reactions of, oh, it's not moving, I guess it's not really a snake, I guess it's a stick and it's probably fine. So, which is something that Joseph Ledoux refers to when he talks about high road versus low road cognition. Low road cognition is kind of automatic reactions, high road cognition is rationally sort of reasoning things out. And automaticity, or those sort of automatic reactions, some of them are sort of innate, but a lot of them can be acquired. So if we think about how difficult it was to learn to ride a bike versus if you've been riding a bike for 20 years, you've automated a lot of these actions, right? Same thing with driving. How many people have ever had that experience where they drive home from work and they pull into their driveway and they realize they totally don't remember the drive at all? Yeah. You have automated a lot of that. And I'm kind of interested in this because I think that I'm really interested in this in terms of game-based learning too, because unconscious competence, which despite the fact that you're trying to sell it, is still something we want to have happening a fair bit. And this is Gloria Gary, which is similar to that model, but it's a slightly different flavored one. but trying to get to like think people kind of doing the right thing. Now, I think if you do it unconsciously, it's a problem. However, we can't afford the cognitive load of being conscious of every single thing we're doing all the time. Like, we just can't. You know, we have to sort of offshore some things to our unconscious, otherwise it's not efficient. So if you were conscious of every single thing you were doing when you were driving all the time, you'd be a terrible driver because you need to be able to focus and pay attention to stuff. And the elephant's a creature of habit. So the elephant likes things that are automated because it's like, okay, I'm going to follow that. This is another favorite study of mine. This is your brain on Tetris. And it looks at glucose usage, which is basically the fuel for lots of things, including thinking. And your brain is kind of a glucose hog. Your brain's usually about 2 to 3% of your total body weight. It uses about up to 20% of your blood glucose, depending on what you're doing. So when you think, you burn a lot of calories, basically, believe it or not. And so this is the PET scan of somebody who is first learning to play Tetris. And this is the PET scan of somebody who's been the same person after they've been playing Tetris for several weeks. So after they've been playing Tetris for several weeks, they're probably pretty good at it by then, right? They're playing at a much higher level. So it's not only that your level of effort remains constant and you get better, your level of effort, the amount of energy you need to do something goes down, and your skill level goes up as you start to develop some of those unconscious competences so you don't have to think about things so hard in order to make them happen. Now this has some interesting implications because it means change is hard. So if you're used to that, if you're used to this level of unconscious competence, then turning back around and walking the bike up the hill when you have to do something new is really hard. Anybody ever try to do that thing where you drive a car on the other side of the road, like in a foreign country? Okay, I won't do it. Get used to it. I won't do it because every time, and we tried to do it in New Zealand, every time I made a left turn, I thought we were gonna die. But it's really hard, right? Because you've automated so much of the process of driving, but in some ways it's harder than when you were learning to drive just from scratch to begin with. Like, because you just have automatic impulses. So this is one of the things I think we really need to also think about is how are we dealing with this with our learners? How are we helping them, with this part? Because we talked about the elephant not liking things that feel hard. And so whenever you're asking somebody to change something where they've already automated part of their process or learning, we're asking them to it's not only as hard as it would be to learn it from scratch, it's actually harder if it's going against an existing pattern or an existing area where they've already automated some of that behavior. Now it's interesting to me, I sometimes refer to this as the sports and things that can kill you conundrum. Because we know this. We know this in sports, we know this in music, we know this in things that can kill you, that you need to have practice, you need to have kind of an opportunity to develop and get comfortable with stuff. So if it's things that can kill you, it could be driving, it could be airplane pilots, it could be doctors. We know that they have to have a lot of practice in those environments. And yet we seem, as a field or a discipline, to forget this when we get into things like management training, right? Now, why would you need this for golf or medicine or pilots or whatever and not need this for management training? Like, why? Of course we don't. And again, you guys are awesome, you already know this. But hopefully giving you some, ideas for ways to sell this to other people. And remember the cake or fruit salad? So if we're asking people to do this thing where we're asking them to bike uphill, they're using a lot of glucose, which seems to have an impact where it expends your sort of willpower resources. So if you've expended a lot of resource, you have a hard time kind of forcing yourself to be disciplined about other things. So people who had easy math problems could more easily do the healthy choice. People who had hard math problems were more likely to do the chocolate cake. The researchers did a lot of, this was Baba Shiv and Dorkin out of Stanford, but the other guy who's done a lot of work on the glucose usage and willpower and things is Roy Baumeister out of Florida, one of the Florida schools. But he came out with a book last year on it if you're interested. So practice can be more important than knowledge in some cases. And I'm going to wrap up here in a minute or two, promise. Practice can be more important. This is a piece that I did. This was actually the teacher training piece, but it's a program that I was working with a few years ago called Project Alert. And this is a drug and alcohol prevention curriculum for middle schoolers. Now, drug and alcohol prevention curriculums, as they came out originally, were very sort of information-based. So very sort of, this is a crack pipe, and here's why crack is bad. Now, again, is the reason we think that kids are getting involved with drugs because nobody's mentioned that it's a bad idea. Yeah, so this is probably not a knowledge problem. So one of the things they really looked at doing was practicing the specific situation where somebody's offering you something. So they would do this over and over and over again. They would do role plays, they would do little sims, they would do all sorts of things around, you're at a party, somebody offers you a beer, what do you say? You're out behind the school and somebody's got a cigarette, and what do you say? Let's try different ways of saying, no thank you. So they had kids practice over and over and over again, and role play over and over and over again, different ways of dealing with this situation, because that's a very fraught situation, right? You're like, I want to look cool, and you're you guys, and I don't know what to say, and da 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 da. And so having a really practiced response of, no, that's okay, I'm on the track team, I shouldn't smoke. Having that ready and right there and ready prepared out there makes it that much, again, much more likely that the behavior is going to happen. And having that as a practice behavior is worth a lot more in some cases than the deeply held belief that smoking is a bad idea. Both are good. You want both, you can have it, but having the practice behavior is more likely to kind of get the behavior across. And the last part was kind of soft anyway. We were going to talk about embodying stuff. Let me see. I think this is one of our big challenges. I think there's something different about saying stuff or generating it yourself than selecting from options. And I think this is going to be one of our big challenges as learning designers, especially in a digital environment. Is how do we get people to actually do it instead of making choices about it? I don't have a good answer to this. I haven't totally figured this one out yet. This is one of my big design challenges. Is if you've got any good strategies, love to hear about them. Let's see. But giving people the opportunity to practice and rehearse gets you over that initial anxiety about it. I recorded a podcast with a friend of mine months ago, and it's still sitting on my desktop waiting to be edited. Now I know I have the technical skills to sit down and download Audacity and get in there and edit the damn file, but I've never done it before, and so it still sits there and it keeps getting shuffled below other priorities on the list. And so, if somebody just made me do it, I'd be like, oh, this is really easy, and it only took me half an hour, and boom, away we go. But the first time is frequently the hardest. When we look at models for change management, like Everett Rogers, this is a great book, he always talks about trialability and observability, being able to try things out, being able to observe other people, so seeing behaviors modeled, being able to try it yourself. How can we kind of increase the opportunities to do those sorts of things? And also, I think there's something about saying something out loud that's interesting, because I think when people say it out loud, then they sort of feel obligated, like a certain amount of self-confirmation bias, to then actually make it happen. Maybe not always, but I think it's an interesting one. Okay, so the physically actually doing it is sort of the stuff under embodied experiences. I'd love to hear more if anybody's got any input on that, because that was a little soft for me in terms of research, but I think it's a really interesting area. But yeah, so those are some of the categories of stuff I'm thinking about. And slides will be posted at that link. They're not there now because my website was arguing with me last night. But I did put up stuff. So if anybody wants a copy of these, they'll be posted at bit.ly ILU 2013. And questions, comments, thoughts? No.
You are just that good.
All right. Either that or it wasn't helpful at all.
All right, thank you very much. That was great.